May 1945. Somewhere on the edge of a collapsing Germany. No one knows the exact moment this photograph was taken, or even the name of the medic who leans in with desperate urgency. The woman, half buried in dirt and fear, appears to be a German civilian, or perhaps a prisoner, her face streaked with soot, her hands clutching a shoulder that seems to scream even louder than she does. Behind them, the watchtower stands silent, as if guarding a truth too heavy for the frame to hold. Why is a military medic kneeling outside the wire instead of inside it? Who is he trying to save? And from what? And why does she look at him not with hatred, but with a mixture of terror and impossible hope? Some historians believe this image captured the last seconds before a secret, long buried, finally surfaced. Others say the real story is far more unsettling. Today, we uncover the truth behind this photograph, and the wound that changed everything. May 12, 1945. Camp Swift, Texas. The air over the red dirt shimmered like glass, pressed down by a heat so heavy it seemed to hum. Tin roofs blinked sharply beneath the midday sun, and dust rolled in slow waves across the open yard where a line of German women stood shoulder to shoulder, their gray uniforms faded into nearly the color of ash. Inside the small medical hut, Corporal Thomas Reed wiped sweat from his forehead, glanced at the clipboard in his hand, and prepared himself for what he expected would be another long, dull afternoon of routine examinations. Height, weight, scars, nothing more. He stepped out into the glare, his boots crunching on gravel, and motioned for the first woman to come inside. The line shifted slightly, nothing more than the shuffle of tired feet, but Reed felt again that strange sense he always got when working with prisoners, the awareness of eyes watching him not with defiance or hatred, but with the stiff, wary silence of people who no longer knew what to expect from the world. Germany had surrendered just days earlier. Europe lay in ruins. But in Texas, the mess hall still smelled of coffee and bacon every morning, and the war felt as distant as a storm he could hear but never see. He worked through the first few women methodically. Names in careful script, thin arms, dust-coated boots. Most answered his questions with brief nods, their English limited or non-existent. Reed moved from one to the next with the same steady practice tone he'd used for months. He was a medic in a country that had already won, and the job, while important, rarely surprised him any more. Then the seventh woman stepped forward. She was slight, no more than 23 or 24, with her dark hair pulled tightly back and streaks of dust marking her cheeks. Something about her posture caught his attention before she said a single word. Her left arm hung freely at her side, but her right stayed pinned tight against her ribs, as if she were afraid the air itself might jostle it. Reed made a small note on his clipboard, restricted movement, and gestured for her to face away from him so he could check her back for scars. When he touched her shoulder, everything changed. She jerked violently, a sharp inhale tearing from her throat. Reed snatched his hand back instinctively, startled. For a split second he thought he had accidentally leaned on a hidden, sun-heated metal pole. But no, the heat had come from her. From beneath her thin cotton shirt, he had felt a burst of warmth so intense it was almost like touching a stove plate. "It burns when you touch it," she said quietly in halting English, her voice trembling even as she tried to steady it. Reed blinked. It made no sense. Skin didn't feel like that unless fever raged through it. But even then, not like this. Not heat radiating outward, pulsing with its own strange life. He studied her more closely, but she refused to meet his gaze, staring straight ahead with the stiff resolve of someone who had learned to survive by silence. What kind of wound keeps burning 4 months after the shell? The question formed in his mind before he could stop it. And why did she hide it all the way from Germany to Texas? He cleared his throat. Are you injured? No, she said instantly. Too fast. He tried again, more gently this time. Any pain? Any wound I should know about? I am well, she insisted. But Reed had been around enough soldiers, German and American alike, to recognize the signs of someone protecting not just a wound, but a truth. He wrote something neutral on the form, though his curiosity simmered like the heat outside. When he motioned for her to lift her arms, she managed to raise the left with no problem. But the right rose only a few inches before she winced sharply, her jaw tightening as if she were holding back a cry. The muscles under her shirt twitched, and even from a foot away Reed could sense the warmth radiating outward, a heat that had no business coming from human flesh. Something was terribly wrong. He stepped back, studying her again with a medic's eye and a soldier's instinct. Germany had fallen. The Reich was in ashes. But here was a woman carrying something across continents, something invisible, dangerous, and burning from the inside out. He dismissed her gently and moved to the next prisoner, but his thoughts remained fixed on that single moment when his fingertips brushed her shoulder and felt a heat so unnatural it seemed to defy reason. The clipboard in his hands suddenly felt heavier. The sun beat down on Camp Swift, the same as ever, steady and merciless. Yet a question hung in the air, tightening like wire between them. Under that scar, whatever it was, lay a secret that would challenge everything both she and he believed about the enemy. Outside, the camp moved with its usual rhythm. Guards calling orders, trucks rumbling past, the distant clang of metal from the motor pool. America at war, but no longer terrified, only disciplined, enormous, and astonishingly well supplied. While German cities lay in ruins, Camp Swift had neat rows of barracks, clean water, and a medical unit stocked better than many frontline hospitals in Europe. It was a country that had built not only weapons but an entire system to sustain an army big enough to fight across 2 oceans, and still treat its prisoners with order and humanity. Reed had never questioned that system before, but now, staring at the line of women still waiting under the heavy Texas sun, he wondered what stories they carried behind their silence. What kind of life had taught a young woman to hide a wound so fiercely she'd allow it to burn its way through her body rather than speak of it? He didn't know yet, but he would. The secret beneath her shoulder blade was already beginning to crack open, and its truth would reach far beyond the walls of Camp Swift. Into battlefields she had fled, oceans she had crossed, and into the heart of what America believed about itself at the end of the greatest war in human history. January 1945 smelled of cold smoke and plaster dust in the small village near Remagen where Marguerite Hoffmann worked. The Third Reich, which had once promised 1,000 years, was collapsing in months. Entire towns shook daily under artillery fire. Roads clogged with ox carts, bicycles, wounded soldiers, and families dragging suitcases toward the west, hoping, without reason, to outrun the war. Marguerite was 23, the daughter of a Heidelberg chemist who had raised her to read labels on laboratory jars the way other children learned fairy tales. She had studied English in school, taken pride in translating bits of American scientific papers, and dreamed of becoming a pharmacist like her father. Instead, the war turned her into a signals clerk stationed near the Ludendorff Bridge, her job to handle encrypted messages and route communications. It was supposed to be safe work, work behind the lines, work that kept women far from the front. That illusion died in a single afternoon. The first shell landed somewhere outside the village, shaking the earth like a monstrous heartbeat. The second came closer, rattling window frames until panes cracked down the center. By the time the third struck, the air itself felt sharp, vibrating with each detonation. Marguerite and the other clerks raced toward the cellar, papers flying from desks, furniture toppling as the house groaned under the bombardment. She was halfway down the stairs when something hit her. There was no warning, no whistle, no shadow, no sense of movement, just a brutal, hot punch between her shoulder blade and her ribs, as if someone had swung a hammer straight from a forge and slammed it into her back. She stumbled forward, nearly falling into the others, the air knocked clean out of her lungs. The smell hit her next. Burned cloth, lime dust shaken from the walls, and something metallic beneath it all. Someone grabbed her arm. "Are you hit?" No," she managed, though her voice broke on the word. She touched her uniform. The wool was smoldering, a small charred circle spreading outward. But there was no blood, at least none she could see, and in the chaos no one stopped to check further. They huddled in the cellar as the building above them shook with blast after blast. Dust drifted down like gray snow, settling in their hair and eyelashes. Each explosion felt like a giant striking the earth, and with each one, Marguerite felt a strange throb deep in her back, hot and growing hotter. When the shelling stopped, they emerged into a street littered with broken beams and shattered glass. Smoke drifted through the air in lazy veils. Someone handed Marguerite a canteen. She sipped, leaning against a half-collapsed doorway, and tried to convince herself that the blow had been nothing more than bruised muscle. She could move her arm, barely, so it couldn't be serious. That night, however, when she lay down on a straw mattress in a requisitioned barn, the truth revealed itself. It burned. Not on the skin, not like a scraped knee or a welt. This was deeper, a heat radiating from inside her shoulder blade. Every breath made it pulse, every movement sent a flare of fire along her ribs. She bit her lip until it bled, trying not to wake the other women sleeping nearby. When exhaustion finally pulled her under, she dreamed of coals buried beneath her flesh. At dawn, the unit began its retreat westward. They moved in jolting trucks and overcrowded wagons, sometimes on foot when fuel ran out. Each bump in the road felt like a spark shooting down her side. She kept her right arm tucked close to her body, pretending the gesture meant nothing. Whenever someone asked if she was injured, she shook her head at once. She'd seen what happened to the wounded. Field hospitals, if one could call them that, were overflowing. A single doctor might see hundreds of wounded in a day. Nurses worked with dirty scissors and reused bandages, cutting fabric from bodies while praying infection wouldn't take hold before the next bombardment. Medicine was scarce. Sulfa powder, once common, had become a rumor. Penicillin was a luxury the collapsing Reich could not produce. A nurse told her quietly one night, "We cut away cloth with dirty scissors and prayed. That is all we can do now." Worse were the whispered stories. The heavily wounded, the ones with shrapnel near bone or lungs, were often sent somewhere else. No one returned. Whether the places were understaffed hospitals, makeshift wards in abandoned buildings, or something darker, no one knew. But they all feared it. To admit she was injured was to risk disappearing. So she kept silent. She wrapped herself tighter each day in denial, hoping the burning would fade. It didn't. The retreat grew more chaotic as American forces closed in from the west and Soviet forces crushed the east. The village they abandoned was smoking rubble by the time they reached another town, only to find that place shelled as well. Rail lines were twisted wrecks. Bridges were falling. Ambulances, when they existed, carried only the men. Germany was cracking apart like thin ice under too many steps. Food grew scarce. Marguerite ate whatever was available: half-rot-hard potatoes, bitter bread, thin soup that tasted of boiled water, and nothing more. Every night when she lay down, the heat in her back returned, pulsing with the rhythm of her own heartbeat. She pressed her left hand against the spot, feeling the skin swollen and tight. Underneath it, something small and sharp shifted when she breathed. She began to understand what must have happened. A fragment, a piece of shrapnel, lodged between bone and muscle, burning slowly as infection crept around it. But she also understood what it meant to acknowledge it. She would be taken from her unit. She might never see daylight again. So she kept walking, kept retreating, kept her right arm pinned to her ribs as if her body itself were guarding the secret. By March, American infantry had reached the area near Remagen. Tanks rolled over cobblestones that had once echoed with parades. The sky was chalked with smoke from burning warehouses. Marguerite and 6 other women hid in a cellar beneath a farmhouse, listening to the thunder of iron tracks overhead. They had been told since childhood that Americans were savages, gangsters who shot prisoners on sight, men who had no honor and no mercy. But the first American who opened the cellar door didn't raise his rifle. He offered water. Still, when he asked in broken German if anyone was wounded, Marguerite forced her features into calm and said, "No." The burning beneath her shoulder had become part of her life now, a companion she feared more than the enemy above her. While she spoke, her mind drifted to the contrast she could not ignore. America, the nation whose soldiers now filled the farmhouse, was producing mountains of jeeps, crates of rations, barrels of medicine. Liberty ships carried supplies by the thousands of tons. The United States had become the arsenal of democracy, an industrial giant turning raw materials into the tools of war faster than any nation in history. Even now, even at the end of all things, American soldiers carried clean bandages, ampules of morphine, and tin after tin of sulfa powder. Germany had none of that left. Not the fuel, not the factories, not the hope. The difference was more than military. It was survival. America's abundance had helped win the war. Soon, though Margarita didn't yet know it, that same abundance would save her life. But in that moment, kneeling in a cellar with her arm pressed tight to her ribs, she could not imagine trusting the hand reaching out to her. Fear had shaped her too deeply. Every story she had been told warned her to hide the wound, to hide the truth, to hide anything the enemy might use against her. So she stayed silent, and the burning stayed with her. A fragment of metal carrying the memory of a collapsing world, buried under her skin as the Reich crumbled around her. The day they were captured near Remagen began with the sound of metal. Tank treads grinding over broken stones, a mechanical growl that vibrated through the beams of the farmhouse where Marguerite and 6 other women hid. They crouched in the cellar, wrapped in stale air and the dust shaken loose by each tremor overhead. One of the clerks whispered what they were all thinking. The Americans. The word tasted like dread. For years, the Reich had fed them pictures of the Yankees as monsters. Lectures, pamphlets, radio broadcasts, all repeating the same claim. The Yankee will shoot prisoners like dogs. Marguerite had seen one leaflet showing a cartoon American trooper grinning while executing captives. Another warned, "Women prisoners will vanish without trace." These images had seeped into her bones. Now, hearing tanks stop just outside, she felt her heartbeat sprinting against her ribs. Boots thudded overhead. Commands in English barked through the dust. Someone kicked the cellar door. A second later, it swung open, flooding the darkness with daylight. They all froze. 3 American soldiers stood at the top of the stairs, helmets tilted forward, rifles slung, uniforms dusty from the march. Marguerite's breath hitched. She waited for the order she had been told all her life would come next. But it didn't. Instead, one soldier lowered his weapon, reached into his canteen carrier, and held out a dented metal bottle. "Wasser?" he asked awkwardly. "Water?" The women blinked at him. It took several seconds for anyone to move. Finally, the eldest among them stepped forward and accepted the canteen with shaking hands. She drank, then passed it down the line. Marguerite tasted the water last. It was warm, metallic, but clean. It slid down her dry throat like something from another world. Then another question came, unexpected and almost absurd in its gentleness. "Anyone wounded?" That was the moment Marguerite's secret tightened inside her. The burning in her shoulder throbbed with every breath, but she shook her head immediately. Wounded meant removed, taken somewhere unknown. Her fear of the Reich's improvised hospitals ran deeper than her fear of the Americans' rifles. The soldier nodded, accepting her answer with no suspicion, no force. He motioned for them to climb out of the cellar. As they emerged into the cold daylight, Marguerite felt her understanding of the world warp slightly. Not break yet, but bend. The Americans did not line them up. They did not aim rifles at their backs. They guided them toward the road without shoving or shouting, keeping a respectful distance. It was the smallest crack in the wall of fear she had built around herself. The journey began immediately. First were the temporary enclosures, fenced fields where hundreds of prisoners gathered under makeshift shelters. Every group looked the same, exhausted, dirty, carrying more questions than possessions. Marguerite stayed close to the other women, instinctively maintaining their small island of familiarity. From these transit camps, they were herded into cattle cars. The floors were covered in old straw, blackened from previous use. A wooden bucket at one end served as a latrine. When the doors slammed shut, darkness swallowed them. The car lurched forward. The smell hit at once: sweat, fear, urine, the sour tang of unwashed bodies pressed together. Hours turned into a day. A day slipped into 2. When the train finally stopped, freezing air rushed in as the doors slid open. They had reached the French coast. The port was a frenzy of noise. Cranes squealed as they swung crates over the water. Chains clattered. Men shouted orders in English and French. The smell of tar, sea salt, wet rope, and diesel filled the air. The harbor itself looked enormous, larger than any German port Marguerite had ever seen, and, unlike those at home, not reduced to rubble. A soldier gestured toward the gray hull of a massive Liberty ship. "Up you go," he said, tapping the gangplank. Marguerite stared up at the vessel. It felt like staring at a moving mountain. She wondered if she would ever touch land again. The hold of the Liberty ship was worse than the cattle car. The air was thick with fuel oil and the stale breath of hundreds of prisoners. Hammocks hung 3 levels high, swaying as the ship pitched. For nearly 2 weeks the sea punished them, rolling, slamming, twisting. Many prisoners vomited until they had nothing left. The floors grew slick despite the crew's efforts to clean. Some prayed. Some stared into the dark. Marguerite clung to her bunk with her left hand, while the right stayed pressed against her ribs. The heat under her skin grew worse in the damp air. Some nights the fever was so intense she had to bite her knuckles to keep from whimpering. But she still told no one. Not the other women, not the guards, not the medical corpsmen who passed through once a day with a flashlight and shouted questions she pretended not to understand. On the 13th morning, shouts echoed through the hold. "Land! Land ahead!" Prisoners surged toward the small ventilation openings along the wall. Marguerite squeezed between two men and peered through the slats. There it was, New York. Skyscrapers rose like silver pillars out of the haze. Tugboats hooted, gulls wheeled overhead. And far to the left, half-shrouded in morning mist, stood a figure she had only ever seen in photographs. A great green woman lifting a torch toward the sky, the Statue of Liberty. A few prisoners laughed bitterly. "Freedom," one said, "but not for us." Still, something about the sight lodged inside her. America was bright, standing, whole. No bombs had smashed its skylines. No fires had gutted its factories. While Europe burned, the United States had kept its cities lit and its ports busy, operating day and night. It was a contrast that pierced her like cold air. From New York, the prisoners were marched on to trains. Long lines of green cars with barred windows. Guards repeated a single word often enough for even the German women to catch it. Texas. Texas. Marguerite rolled the word on her tongue silently. She had heard of cowboys from old magazines her father kept in the shop and had once seen a picture of a desert under an endless sky. But she had no sense of where it truly was or why they were being sent there. As the train pushed inland, the air warmed. Spring green faded into harsher browns and reds. The countryside thickened with dust. Some prisoners joked nervously about rattlesnakes or being marched into nothingness. Others whispered, "Is Texas where they disappear us?" Marguerite didn't ask out loud. She simply stared out the narrow slit of the window, holding her aching arm close, wondering how far fear could stretch before it broke, and whether, somewhere in the vast unknown ahead, she would finally see what America really was. She didn't know it yet, but the first answer would come soon. Not from a rifle, not from a shouted order, but from the hands of a medic who refused to look away from the burn beneath her skin. Camp Swift rose out of the red Texas dirt like a small city under the sun. Long, white barracks lined up in disciplined rows, their roofs flashing silver whenever the light hit just right. Low scrub trees dotted the ground between buildings, their leaves rattling in the dry wind. Beyond the main gate stretched miles of fencing crowned with barbed wire, but inside the wire the camp pulsed with an order and energy that felt nothing like a battlefield. For the German prisoners who arrived in the spring of 1945, the first shock wasn't the fences. It was the smell. Every morning, as the sun pushed up over the horizon, the clang of the mess hall bell rippled through the compound. Within minutes, the air filled with the unmistakable scent of coffee and bacon drifting from the American kitchens. It threaded through the barracks, through the laundry lines, even through the medical hut. Some POWs would close their eyes and breathe deeply, and later many would admit, almost sheepishly, that the smell alone told them they were in another world. Texas held more German prisoners than almost any other state. Across America, nearly 400,000 POWs were spread through dozens of camps: Oklahoma, Nebraska, Michigan, Colorado. Camp Swift alone could house more than 10,000. It ran like a machine built from discipline, abundance, and a confidence that the war's end was inevitable. The contrast with Germany was staggering. In Camp Swift, prisoners received 3 hot meals a day: meat, vegetables, butter, bread, still warm from American ovens. They slept on mattresses filled with cotton, washed their faces with real soap, and shaved with razors that weren't dull from overuse. Clean water flowed without rationing. Even the weather, harsh as it was, could not overshadow the simple fact that here, in the heart of Texas, the structure of daily life continued as though the world were not collapsing elsewhere. One POW later wrote, "We ate better there than in the last winter at home. Another admitted, "It was confusing. We were the enemy, yet they fed us as if we were their own men." Americans watching such stories generations later often paused at this point, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it stirred something deeper, a sense of pride in what their country once was, a reminder that in 1945, when the nation was weary from years of war, it still found the discipline and moral conviction to treat even its adversaries with fairness. The greatest generation had built a system that could defeat tyranny abroad, yet remain humane at home. Nowhere was that contrast clearer than the medical hut where Corporal Thomas Reed spent his days. Reed had grown up on the north side of Chicago, the son of a pharmacist who taught him how to count pills before he knew how to ride a bicycle. He enlisted when the war came, trained for infantry, learned how to fire a rifle in rain and snow. But a training accident shattered his leg just weeks before he was due to ship out. Army surgeons saved the limb, inserting a steel rod that would stay with him for life. Instead of Normandy, he was sent to Camp Swift. His job was a mixture of clerical work and routine medical checks. He measured blood pressure, listened to lungs, noted scars. He vaccinated hundreds of POWs against typhus and smallpox. Most days the work felt like a strange parody of what he had trained for. "I trained to break bodies," he once muttered to another medic, "and now I record blood pressure." But Reed did the work with quiet seriousness. That was what his generation did. They accepted the assignment, whatever it was, and tried to do it well. If anything defined the greatest generation, it was not glory, but steadiness, the willingness to shoulder responsibility even when the war placed them somewhere unexpected. In mid-May, whispers began spreading through the camp. Frauen POWs. Frauen here? Women prisoners were rare, almost unheard of in large camps like Swift. Most were clerks, nurses, or auxiliaries captured during the final weeks of Germany's collapse. The day they arrived, the dust rose in thick clouds as 2 trucks rattled to a stop inside the compound. The guards shouted orders. The rear flaps opened. One by one, 15 German women climbed down, their uniforms faded and stiff with travel. Some shielded their eyes from the glare. Others stood straight, hands at their sides, determined not to appear afraid. Members of the Women's Army Corps, the BWACs, took charge immediately. They lined the women up, accounted for each name, and escorted them toward a separate fenced section of the camp set aside for female POWs. Their lives would be different from the men's. Work details in the kitchens, the laundry, the sewing rooms. It was still confinement, still barbed wire, but cleaner and safer than anything they had known in months. Reed watched from a distance, leaning against the doorway of the medical hut. He wasn't scheduled to examine the new arrivals until the following day, but he found himself studying them as they passed. Their hollow eyes, their stiff posture, the way dust streaked their cheeks. One woman in particular caught his attention. She moved carefully, too carefully. Even the jostling of the truck bed had made her flinch. Her right arm stayed pressed against her ribs as though she were bracing herself against something unseen. While the others adjusted their packs or wiped sweat from their faces, she kept her movements small and precise, as if afraid her body might betray her. Reed narrowed his eyes. Something was off. He tried to push the thought aside, returning to his paperwork. But long after the women disappeared into the POW enclosure, the image of her hunched posture remained. The next morning, the sun rose hard and hot, pouring light across the rows of barracks. Reed arrived early at the medical hut, unlocking the door and stepping into air that already carried the scent of disinfectant and wood warmed by heat. Outside, prisoners queued under the direction of the guards, their boots stirring little storms of dust. When the group of women approached, escorted by 2WX, Reed felt a prickle of anticipation, unusual for someone accustomed to routine. He nodded to the guards, flipped open a clean stack of forms, and gestured for the first woman to enter. One by one, they came through, thin, tired, wary. Reed listened to their lungs, checked their eyes, recorded their measurements. Some spoke a few words of English. Others stayed silent. Their hands trembled slightly when he placed the cold stethoscope on their backs. They were young, most barely older than the American soldiers who patrolled the camp. Then she entered, the woman from the truck. Up close, she seemed even smaller. Dust clung to her hairline. Her face was pale beneath the Texas glare, and her right arm remained locked to her side, as if held there by an invisible band. "Name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then answered in deliberate English. "Marguerite Hoffman." Reed wrote it down. The handwriting on the page looked strangely formal beside her thin, exhausted frame. "Step forward," he said. She obeyed, but stiffly. Reed noted the way her shoulder twitched each time she shifted her weight. He sensed her fear, but also something else. Resistance, guardedness, the instinctive recoil of someone who had learned that pain lived too close to the surface. He motioned for her to turn around so he could examine her back. As she complied, slowly, cautiously, Reed felt, again, that faint spark of unease he'd felt watching her from the doorway. Something was hidden beneath her stillness, something pressing against the silence. In that moment, Marguerite stood in the center of the medical hut, spine straight, hands clenched lightly at her sides, her body tense as if waiting for a blow. And Reed, though he didn't yet know the truth beneath her skin, sensed that this was not an ordinary exam. It was the beginning of a battle she had been fighting alone, one he would soon be drawn into whether he wanted to be or not. Reed knew something was wrong the moment Marguerite tried to lift her right arm during the exam. Her left rose without effort, but the right barely moved a hand's width before she gasped, her breath cutting short like someone had stabbed a wire straight into her ribs. Her face tightened. A tremor passed over the skin beneath her cotton shirt, an involuntary twitch that told Reed more than any word she might offer. He stepped closer. "Let me check the shoulder," he said quietly. She didn't protest, but she didn't agree either. She stood rigidly, bracing herself, eyes focused on a spot on the floor. When Reed laid 2 fingers lightly on her shoulder blade, he jerked back in surprise. The heat radiating under her skin was unmistakable. Not warm, not feverish, but hot, as if a live ember had been trapped beneath her flesh. Marguerite flinched violently. "No," she whispered. "Please, no hospital, no separation." Reed's brow furrowed. Her reaction wasn't the panic of someone hiding a minor injury. It was something deeper, instinctive, desperate. He reached again, more carefully, but she twisted away. "It burns when you touch it," she said, her English strained but clear. That phrase lodged itself in him. Burns. Wounds didn't burn simply from contact, unless infection had tunneled deep into tissue, unless metal sat lodged in a place the body could not purge. Camp regulations were explicit. Any prisoner with a potentially serious injury had to be examined thoroughly and sent to advanced care if needed. But the rules inside Margaret's head were older, harsher, etched by months of retreat and rumor. In Germany, to admit injury was to risk disappearing. The next 3 days tested both of them. Reed returned to her barracks area morning and evening, always with a translator or another medic present, careful to follow protocol. He spoke gently, explaining the danger of infection, how untreated shrapnel could fester, how bone could be eaten away by bacteria, how even a small wound could kill slowly and painfully. He talked about penicillin, the new miracle drug America was producing by the tens of millions of units. He described sulfa powder, sterile dressings, operating rooms with gleaming steel instruments, and surgeons who had seen every kind of wound the war could produce. But Marguerite listened with the expression of someone standing at the edge of a cliff. No operation, she repeated again and again. No hospital. Reed didn't understand at first. To him, a hospital was safety, structure, the promise of treatment. But her memories dragged her elsewhere, back to German field stations where men screamed through nights with too little morphine, where gangrene spread because there were no antibiotics, where surgical tools were often whatever could be boiled quickly between bombardments. She remembered walking past a ward in Belgium, where a man begged a nurse to end his life because the infection had already taken his leg. Another nurse whispered that the most severely wounded were sometimes transferred and never returned. Whether it was truth or rumor didn't matter. Fear had hardened those memories into law. Reed tried logic, he tried reassurance, he even tried humor once, and it fell flat. Nothing broke through. On the third evening, Gertrude, the older prisoner who spoke excellent English, approached Reed outside the mess hall. "She is afraid," Gertrude said, "not of you, but of what you do not understand." Reed frowned. "Help me understand." "In Germany," Gertrude said, folding her hands slowly. "The wounded who went behind the front lines did not always return. She thinks if she leaves this camp she will vanish. Not killed, simply gone." She paused. Her fear is not irrational. It is memory. That night, Reed lay awake on his cot, listening to the insects trill outside the hut. He thought of his own hospital stay after his leg injury, the crisp sheets, the steady morphine drip, the kind surgeon who told him he'd walk again. He thought of his father's pharmacy back in Chicago, shelves perfectly organized, glass bottles clean enough to reflect his childhood face. His world had always been sterile, ordered, protected. Hers had been the opposite. By morning, he knew the next step. He signed out the key to the dispensary cabinet, a small room off the main medical hut. It was cool inside, the air thick with the sharp scent of antiseptic. Sunlight filtered through slatted windows, glinting off rows of glass ampoules, tins of sulfa powder, and sealed packages of gauze. Stainless steel instruments rested in wrapped bundles, their edges gleaming like polished bone. 2 guards escorted Marguerite in. She stood in the doorway, uncertain, her right arm held close. Reed opened the cabinet. "This," he said gently, "is what we use." He handed her a bottle. Penicillin suspended in clear fluid. The label read, U.S. Army Medical Department. Marguerite held it carefully as though it might break in her fingers. She turned it slowly, reading the English words she understood, the ones she didn't, the ones that made sense only because of the tone in Reed's voice. "Medicine," she murmured. "So much." He nodded. "More than most German units saw in the last year." He showed her a sterile bandage still in its sealed wrapper. Morphine ampoules that sparkled like droplets of frozen light. Instruments wrapped in crisp cloth, untouched by dirt or blood. This was the second shock of her time in America. She had been told the Americans were crude, violent, without honor. But before her were supplies so abundant and clean they looked almost impossible. The abundance of the arsenal of democracy stood in that small room. The industrial might that had built ships, tanks, planes, and also enough medicine to treat the enemy. Her breathing changed, a small tremor in her chest. "You promise?" she asked, voice cracking. "I will not wake up in screaming pain?" Reed met her eyes, steady and calm. "I promise. We will make you sleep. We will remove the metal. Then you will heal." Something in her broke then. Not loudly, not visibly, but with the quiet collapse of a belief system that had kept her alive for months. She nodded once, sharply, like someone accepting a burden they could no longer carry. He handed her the consent form. She gripped the pen in her left hand, her good hand, and tried to steady it. The signature shook, the ink wobbling slightly across the page. But she signed. It was the moment she surrendered, not to America, but to hope. The historical weight of that moment was larger than she knew. By 1945, the United States had built more than 300,000 military hospital beds around the world. It was producing antibiotics at a rate unimaginable before the war. Hundreds of millions of units of penicillin, millions of sulfa tablets. American medical corpsmen carried supplies that civilian hospitals in Europe had not seen for months. The United States had weaponized not only steel and fuel, but cleanliness, organization, and humane treatment. And now that machinery of care turned toward a single German woman. The surgery took nearly 3 hours. Major Pritchard, the lead surgeon, opened the wound along the right shoulder blade. Pus welled up immediately, thick and yellow-green, a sign of deep, long-standing infection. He irrigated the cavity again and again with antiseptic solution, clearing dead tissue while nurses swapped instruments so swiftly the air felt like it hummed with motion. "There," the surgeon muttered, touching a hard object buried in a nest of scar tissue. With delicate forceps he extracted it, a jagged piece of metal the size of a fingernail, darkened by months inside a human body. "Another month," Pritchard said to Reed afterward, "and the infection might have reached the bone. After that—" Well, he did not finish the sentence. They packed the wound with sulfa powder, placed clean layers of gauze, and stitched her closed. As Marguerite slept in the recovery ward, her body began the slow process of clawing its way back from the edge. But the deeper shift, the one she would carry for life, had already happened. She had entrusted her survival to the people she had been raised to fear. And they had saved her. When Marguerite woke after surgery, the first thing she noticed was the smell. Not the sour, metallic scent of infection she had grown accustomed to, but something clean. Soap, disinfectant, starch, and underneath it all, the faint sweetness of polished floors warmed by sunlight. A ceiling fan turned lazily above her bed, pushing cool air across her face. For a moment she felt disoriented. No shouting, no groaning wounded, no orderlies running between cots with too little morphine and too much fear. She blinked slowly, trying to understand where she was. A nurse appeared beside her, a woman in crisp white with a soft southern accent. "Good morning, Miss Hoffman. You're awake." Miss Hoffman, not prisoner, not number 2130, just Miss Hoffman. The nurse checked her pulse, examined the dressing on her shoulder, and made a note on a clipboard. Everything she did was calm, practiced, gentle. When she left, another nurse arrived to change the bandages, speaking to Marguerite as though she were any patient in need, not someone who had worn an enemy uniform only months earlier. The wound still hurt, a deep, dull ache, but the burning was gone. That alone felt like a small miracle. In the bed beside hers lay an older German man named Ernst, captured months earlier. His hair was thin, his hands marked by age and labor. He watched the nurses move between beds with the faint smile of someone who had finally allowed himself to relax. "They take good care of you," Ernst said in German. Better than we ever expected. Marguerite nodded. Words were difficult. Ernst lowered his voice. That American medic, the one who speaks softly, he visits often. He looks at you like he sees a person, not a prisoner. He paused, then added, he sees a patient. That is different. The simplicity of the statement hit her with more force than the fragment ever had. Someone saw her not as a threat, not as a burden, but as a human being needing help. And in those quiet days in the ward, something inside her began to shift. Reed visited that afternoon, his uniform shirt rolled at the sleeves, clipboard under his arm. When he saw her awake, a look of relief crossed his face. You're through the worst of it, he said. The surgeon removed the fragment. The infection should fade now. She studied him, this American who had stood between her and a slow, certain death. His presence felt steady, familiar, even safe. Before she could stop herself, she murmured, "Thank you." Reed looked down at his boots for a moment, embarrassed. "Just doing my job." But later that night, when the ward was quiet, he wrote a letter home to his parents in Chicago. "I was trained to break bodies," he wrote. "But here I stitch, record, and reassure. The enemy has faces and names now. One of them is a young woman who carried our artillery in her shoulder. I cannot bring myself to think of her as an enemy anymore." For Reed, the war was changing, not in strategy or maps, but in the quiet, personal way that mattered most. The lines that divided nations were powerful, but the lines separating one human being from another were thinner than he had ever understood. 2 weeks later, Marguerite returned to Camp Swift. The heat hit her like a wall the moment she stepped from the truck. Dry, relentless, carrying the smell of dust and sun-baked earth. But something inside her had shifted. Her right arm rested in a proper sling now. And though her movements were slow, they no longer carried the tension of constant pain. Her hair was neatly tied, her posture straighter, her eyes softer. The women in her barracks noticed immediately. "You smile now," one of them observed. Another added, "It is as if they cut out a weight from your mind, too." Back in the laundry hut, where steam rose from basins and shirts snapped on the lines, Marguerite found herself humming old songs she hadn't thought of since childhood. The rhythm of work felt lighter. Even the guards seemed to sense the change. They nodded politely when passing, offering brief greetings but never lingering. When Reed saw her again during a routine checkup, he asked, "How is the arm?" "Better," she answered. Then, after a pause, "Truly better." He marked it on his chart, but the truth of her words was written in her expression far more clearly than on paper. By late summer, Texas cotton was ready. The fields around Camp Swift stretched endlessly, white tufts bursting from dry, sharp bolls that cut skin if handled too quickly. Nearly 100,000 German POWs across America worked similar fields in 1945, replacing the American men still overseas. It was hard labor, hot, repetitive, back-breaking. But for many prisoners, it was the closest thing to normal life they had known in years. Marguerite joined the women's work detail. The guards walked beside them with rifles slung casually across their shoulders, more for regulation than threat. At intervals, a truck came by with barrels of water. The guards called out in a friendly drawl, "Don't work too fast. This heat can kill you quicker than we can." It was kindness of the simplest sort, but kindness nonetheless. Marguerite bent to the plants, pulling cotton slowly with her left hand while testing how far her right shoulder could stretch without pain. Each tug sent a faint tug deep into the healing tissue, but it was bearable. Sweat stung her eyes. Dust coated her tongue, and still she felt a strange calm in the work. Around her, white rose rippled under the Texas sun like waves on a silent sea. Beyond the wire fence, the sky was impossibly blue, the kind of open, endless blue that Germany had not seen in months under its smoke-choked clouds. It occurred to her that two worlds existed in that moment, the world under the sky, free, open, indifferent to nations, and the world behind the wire, contained, orderly, ruled by human decisions. She lived in the second world, but for the first time since her capture, she felt she could see the first. During one of the water breaks, Reed arrived with the camp doctor to check for heat stroke among the workers. He walked down the row until he reached her. "How's the arm today?" he asked. She wiped sweat from her brow. "Better," she said again. "Better, each day." Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding forged from pain, fear, and the quiet moments of recovery. That evening, in the women's barracks, Margaret wrote a letter to her father in Heidelberg. The pencil shook a little, but her mind was clear. "We are still prisoners," she wrote, "but we are not treated as animals. It is confusing to remember what we were told about these people." She hesitated, then added, "Father, I think much of what we feared was not true." She folded the letter slowly, aware of the enormity of what she had just admitted, not just to him, but to herself. And if a voice were to narrate the feelings of those who hear this story decades later, it might say, "There was a time when America had full shelves and full hearts, when even the enemy lay under clean white sheets." Many today feel that time is gone. But stories like this remind us it was real, and that compassion once shown does not vanish with the decades. In the cotton fields of Texas, under the wide American sky, Marguerite Hoffman learned the truth her childhood had hidden from her, that mercy could cross borders far more easily than armies, and once shown, it had the power to rewrite everything she believed about the enemy, and about herself. By the winter of 1946, Camp Swift felt strangely quiet. The war was long over. Orders had come. Nearly 300 German prisoners were scheduled to leave on a transport that would begin their long journey back across the Atlantic. Trucks idled near the front gate, their engines coughing white plumes into the cold morning air. Snow dusted the red dirt in thin patches, softening the harsh lines of the barracks. Marguerite stood among the departing prisoners, a small bundle of belongings in her arms. Her right shoulder was still tender, but healed. She felt the stitches beneath her skin like a faint memory, one that no longer burned. Reed found her near the infirmary, his breath forming ghosts in the frosty air. He held something in his gloved hand. "The surgeon kept this on a shelf," he said. "I thought you should have it." It was the glass vial. Inside floated the tiny twisted shard of metal that had almost ended her life. In the clear liquid, under the pale Texas sun, it looked harmless, just a dark fleck suspended in quiet. "It's your story now," Reed added. She turned the vial slowly, watching the fragment catch the light. For months it had burned under her skin. Now it was cool to the touch, silent, contained, defeated. She looked up. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. Regulations didn't allow anything more intimate than a handshake, but when they clasped hands, it felt weighted with the entire journey between them. Enemy to patient, fear to trust, survival to possibility. Moments later, she climbed into the back of the truck. Reed stepped away as the convoy rumbled out of Camp Swift, leaving only a lingering cloud of dust and the soft echo of boots on gravel. The voyage home was long and cold. On the ships, wind cut across the deck like a blade. At night, she lay in her bunk listening to the creak of steel hulls and the muffled talk of soldiers who were no longer enemies but simply men going home. Germany, when she finally saw it again, looked like a wounded animal. Bridges were collapsed into rivers, their twisted girders jutting from the water like broken ribs. Entire blocks of Heidelberg lay in blackened ruins. But among the rubble, life stirred. Universities reopened. Civilians swept glass from classrooms. American occupation officials worked with German faculty to rebuild the chemistry department. Her father, older, thinner, but alive, embraced her with shaking hands. He told her of new programs funded by the Allies, of plans to reopen laboratories, of shipments of American equipment meant to restart scientific research. He urged her to continue her studies, and for the first time in years, Marguerite felt the future open before her like a door. She returned to chemistry not because the past had vanished, but because she understood what had saved her: medicine, knowledge, the belief that science could heal what war had broken. She studied, worked, translated papers, learned new techniques from Allied instructors. By the early 1950s, West German factories were producing millions of doses of antibiotics: penicillin, streptomycin, sulfonamides. Much of the knowledge had originated in American labs. Some of the equipment had arrived in wooden crates stamped U.S. Army. A quiet truth wove itself through her work. The medicine that had once saved Allied soldiers now flowed from German factories, too, and one of the people standing at those lab benches had once lain on an American operating table as the enemy. She and Reed exchanged letters for years. In 1952, she sent him a photograph, herself standing outside a rebuilt university building, degree in hand, the winter sun glowing on the stone archway behind her. Inside the envelope was a short note. "Dear Thomas, I thought you would want to know I finished. I still have the fragment. It reminds me that even very small pieces of metal and very small mercies can change the line of a whole life." When Reed received the letter, he was behind the counter of the pharmacy he now owned in Chicago. The store smelled of chalk, rubbing alcohol, and fresh paper labels. Shelves of antibiotics lined the walls, the same medicines that had once been scarce miracles in Europe. He showed the photo to his wife, folded the letter carefully, and placed it in a box with others. Years later, he would take the box down to show his grandchildren. "When you hear about the war," he told them, "remember not only tanks and bombs, remember also a woman with metal in her shoulder, someone we saved because it was the right thing to do." Decades passed. Marguerite lived a long life, raised a family, and worked in laboratories that helped lay the foundation for modern German medicine. When she died in her 80s, her daughter sorted through her papers and found the small glass vial, still sealed, still holding the dark sliver of metal. She brought it, along with the letters from Chicago, to a small local museum in Heidelberg that collected everyday stories from the war years. The curator placed the items in a glass case with a simple tag: "Shell fragment removed from German prisoner, Texas, 1945. Visitors walked past quietly. Many didn't stop. They were drawn to larger exhibits: maps, uniforms, photographs of ruined streets. But some paused. They leaned close, studying the little vial, imagining the heat under the skin, the long sea voyage, the bright light of the operating room, and the American hand offering help. The guide told them the short version of the story: a young woman, a hidden wound, an American medic. A choice to trust that changed 2 lives, and perhaps many more. If a voice could speak directly to those watching the story now, it might say, "In a world at war, America chose to build hospitals big enough to heal even the enemy." That is a kind of victory no parade can show. Many Americans today look back on that greatest generation with longing for a country poor in gadgets, but richer in duty and mercy. This story is one small window into that America. We argue more now. We trust less, but the same nation once fed and healed those who came to kill its sons. The question is not whether that America existed. It did. The question is whether we still remember how to be it. And for the descendants of POWs who watch this today, if your father or grandfather once wore a German uniform and survived a camp in Texas, there's a chance he lived because a young American medic refused to look away from a burning shoulder. His mercy gave your family its future. Flags fade, borders shift. But a small vial in a quiet museum still catches the light and tells a different kind of World War II story. One where America's greatest weapon wasn't its artillery, but its decision to treat an enemy as a patient and a person.